The woodsman found the fallen giant at 3:42 p.m., 3 kilometers deep into wilderness that hadn't seen human presence in decades, and knew immediately that this massive Douglas fir would become his home for the next 2 days. The tree had fallen sometime within the last year, probably during the winter storms that battered this coastal range, and had landed at a slight angle, propped up by its own massive limbs and the surrounding vegetation. But what made it extraordinary, what made the woodsman stop and stare, was the trunk itself. It was hollow. Completely hollow. Fire had gutted the interior decades ago, probably while the tree still stood, creating a perfectly cylindrical chamber that ran for nearly 8 meters through the massive trunk. The opening at the base, where the root ball had torn free from the earth, was easily 2 meters wide and tall enough that he could stand upright inside. The wood walls were thick, solid, charred black on the interior but structurally sound. It was a natural shelter better than anything he could have built with tools and a week of work. The woodsman was 46 years old, bearded and weathered from a lifetime spent more in forests than in towns. He'd come into this wilderness alone, deliberately, seeking the kind of solitude and self-reliance that modern life made almost impossible to find. 2 days. 2 nights. No tent, no pre-built shelter, nothing but his pack and his skills and whatever the forest provided. He'd hoped to find a suitable spot to build a lean-to or debris shelter. Instead, he'd found this, a fallen cathedral of wood that nature had prepared specifically for what he needed. But finding the tree was only the beginning. Transforming a hollow log into livable shelter would require work, skill, and every hour of daylight remaining. He dropped his pack at the base of the tree and climbed inside to assess what he had to work with. The interior was remarkable. The charred walls had been smoothed by decades of weather, creating surfaces that were surprisingly clean. The floor was dirt and decomposing wood, relatively level, covered with a layer of needles and forest debris that had blown in through the openings. Small gaps between the trunk and the ground where the tree sat on its support limbs created natural ventilation holes. The space was maybe 2 meters wide at the base, tapering slightly as it ran back into the trunk. 8 meters deep, which meant he could set up a sleeping area far back from the entrance where it would be most protected and warmest. Light filtered in through the entrance and through several small gaps where branches had broken through the trunk wall. Those gaps would need to be addressed. They'd let in cold air and potentially rain, but they also provided ventilation, which was critical if he planned to have any kind of fire inside or near the shelter. The woodsman stood inside the hollow trunk and allowed himself a moment of pure satisfaction. This was exactly the kind of discovery that made wilderness living feel like partnership with nature rather than battle against it. The forest had provided. Now he needed to be worthy of the gift. At 4 p.m., with maybe 3 hours of working light remaining, he began the transformation process. First task: clean the interior. He used a dead branch as a broom, sweeping out the accumulated debris, clearing the floor down to relatively solid dirt and decomposed wood. The charred walls didn't need cleaning, they were actually beneficial, the carbon layer providing a degree of water resistance. As he worked, he discovered features he'd missed in his initial assessment. A natural shelf where a branch stub had broken off, perfect for storing gear. A section of wall where the charring had created a smooth, almost glass-like surface. Several small holes near the back that created a natural chimney effect. Warm air would rise and exit, drawing fresh air in from the entrance. The tree was better than good. It was perfect. Second task: gather materials for improvement. The tree provided shelter from rain and wind, but it would need enhancement to be truly comfortable. He needed bedding material for insulation from the cold ground. Materials to cover the gaps in the trunk. Firewood. Stones for a fire pit if he decided to build one inside. If you're captivated by real wilderness skills, by the kind of resourcefulness that lets you turn a hollow tree into a home, subscribe to the Old World Survival right now. We bring you authentic bushcraft and survival techniques. No fake scenarios, no manufactured drama, just real skills used in real situations. Hit that subscribe button because what comes next shows exactly how to transform raw nature into functional shelter. The woodsman worked with the focused efficiency of someone who'd done this kind of work for decades. He moved through the surrounding forest, gathering materials with careful selection. For bedding, armfuls of dry ferns that grew in thick patches near a stream 40 meters away. The ferns were perfect, dry, springy, providing both cushioning and insulation. He made multiple trips, each time returning with arms loaded, building up a layer inside the tree that would eventually be thick enough to sleep on comfortably. For insulation, moss. Not the wet, living moss, but the dry, fibrous moss that accumulated on dead logs. This he packed into the larger gaps in the trunk wall, stuffing it tight, creating barriers against wind and moisture. For the entrance, he found several large slabs of bark that had fallen from other dead trees. These could be positioned to create a partial door, blocking wind while still allowing ventilation and access. And firewood. Always firewood. He gathered deadfall in 3 categories: fine kindling from the driest twigs he could find, finger-thick branches for building the fire, and arm-thick logs for sustained burning. The wood went into a pile just outside the tree's entrance, protected from potential rain by the massive trunk itself. By 6:15 p.m., with twilight approaching, he'd accumulated what he estimated was 2 days' worth of firewood. The interior of the tree had been transformed. Thick fern bedding at the back, gaps sealed with moss, the bark slabs positioned near the entrance ready to be deployed. The shelter was functional. Now he needed to make it livable. The fire was the critical element. He could build it inside the tree near the entrance. The natural chimney effect and the charred walls that wouldn't ignite made it possible, or outside just beyond the entrance. Inside would provide more warmth. Outside would be safer and create less smoke issues. He decided on a compromise, a fire pit positioned right at the entrance, technically outside but close enough that radiant heat would penetrate deep into the tree's interior. He cleared a space of all burnable material, digging down to mineral soil. Then he surrounded the cleared area with a ring of stones he'd gathered from a nearby creek bed, fist-sized river rocks that would absorb and radiate heat for hours. The fire pit was positioned perfectly. Smoke would vent naturally away from the tree. Heat would radiate inward. He could sit in the entrance, protected from the elements, tending the fire while staying dry and warm. At 6:47 p.m., as darkness settled over the forest, the woodsman built his first fire. He arranged his tinder bundle, dry inner bark from a cedar tree, shredded into fine fibers. Kindling stacked in a modified teepee formation. Larger sticks positioned to catch once the kindling was established. He struck his ferro rod, sending sparks cascading into the tinder. On the 3rd strike, an ember caught. He bent close, cupped his hands, and blew gently. The ember glowed brighter. Smoke appeared. More breath, careful and controlled. Then flame. The fire caught and spread, growing from tiny flicker to steady flame to crackling blaze within minutes. Light pushed back the darkness. Heat began radiating into the hollow tree. The sound of burning wood, that primal comfort sound, filled the evening air. The woodsman sat at the entrance of his tree shelter, tending the fire, and felt the profound satisfaction of having created safety and comfort from raw wilderness. By 7:30 p.m., with the fire burning steadily, he began preparing his first meal. His pack contained simple provisions: rice, dried beans, jerked meat, coffee, basic spices. Enough for several days if needed, but he planned to supplement with whatever the forest provided. Water was no issue. The stream where he'd gathered ferns was close enough to access easily, flowing clear and cold from the mountains above. He'd filled his metal pot there, and now it sat on rocks at the fire's edge, heating toward a boil. While the water heated, he explored the immediate area around his tree shelter by firelight. The forest here was old growth, trees that had been standing for centuries, creating a canopy so thick that the forest floor was relatively clear of undergrowth. Ferns and moss dominated, along with the massive nurse logs that were decomposing back into the soil that had created them. He found mushrooms, chanterelles, growing in clusters near a rotting stump. He knew these mushrooms, had harvested them since childhood, recognized their golden color and distinctive ridges. A gift from the forest. He gathered a handful, enough to add to his rice, to transform a simple meal into something special. Back at the fire, He prepared his dinner with the care of someone who understood that food in the wilderness was more than just calories. It was ritual, comfort, connection to the act of living. Rice cooked with stream water, chanterelles sautéed in a small amount of oil he'd brought, jerked meat softened in the cooking liquid. The smell was incredible: wood smoke, cooking food, forest air. The taste, when he finally ate, was better than any restaurant meal he'd had in months. At 8:45 p.m., with his stomach full and the fire burning low to coals, the woodsman prepared his sleeping area. He'd laid the fern bedding thick, nearly 20 centimeters deep, creating a mattress that would insulate him from the cold ground. His sleeping bag went on top of that, rated to -10°C, more than adequate for the mild autumn night ahead. But before sleeping, he sat at the entrance of his tree shelter and simply existed in the moment. The fire crackled softly. The forest around him rustled with the small sounds of nocturnal life beginning its nightly routines. The air smelled of wood smoke and pine and earth. This was why he came to places like this. Not to prove anything or accomplish some grand goal, but simply to exist in a way that modern life made almost impossible. To have shelter that he'd created from what nature provided. To eat food he'd prepared over a fire he'd built. To sleep in a place where silence was actual silence, not the muted roar of distant traffic. At 9:30 p.m., he banked the fire, covering it with ash to slow the burn, positioning larger logs that would smolder through the night, creating coals he could resurrect in the morning without having to start from scratch. Then he retreated into the hollow tree, back to where the sleeping bag waited on its bed of ferns. The interior of the tree was noticeably warmer than the outside air. The thick wooden walls held heat like insulation, the enclosed space creating a microclimate that the fire had warmed and would maintain through the night. He climbed into the sleeping bag and lay in complete darkness, listening to the forest settle around him. The fire's glow created flickering light that penetrated perhaps 2 meters into the tree's interior, casting dancing shadows on the charred walls. The woodsman had spent hundreds of nights in the wilderness, in tents, under tarps, in lean-tos and snow caves and every kind of improvised shelter imaginable. But there was something uniquely satisfying about this fallen tree, about sleeping inside what had once been a living giant, now transformed into protection and home. He thought about the tree's life, how long it had stood, what it had witnessed, the slow fire that had hollowed it while it still lived, the final storm that had brought it down. And now this second life, this new purpose, sheltering a human who understood to be grateful for the gift. At 10:15 p.m., warm and comfortable in his sleeping bag, with the forest quiet around him and the fire's coals glowing softly at the entrance, the woodsman let himself drift toward sleep. Tomorrow would bring new projects, improvements to the shelter, more exploration, perhaps some fishing in the stream. But tonight was complete. Tonight was perfect. He'd found a fallen giant and made it home. And in the morning, he'd wake to build a fire, make coffee, and live another day in partnership with the wilderness that had provided everything he needed. The hollow tree creaked softly, settling into the night. The woodsman smiled in the darkness and let sleep claim him. 6:32 a.m. The woodsman woke to gray dawn light filtering through the entrance of his tree shelter, and the sound of a varied thrush calling somewhere in the canopy above. He lay in his sleeping bag for a moment, oriented himself, and registered the simple fact that he was comfortable. Actually comfortable. The fern bedding had compressed slightly overnight, but still provided excellent insulation from the ground. The sleeping bag had kept him warm without ever feeling too hot. The tree's interior had maintained a temperature noticeably higher than the outside air, creating a microclimate that had required no middle-of-the-night adjustments. He'd slept better than he had in weeks. The fire at the entrance had burned down to ash and a few remaining coals, exactly as planned. He could see them glowing faintly in the dim light, ready to be resurrected with kindling and breath. The woodsman emerged from his sleeping bag into the cool morning air, maybe 8 degrees Celsius, based on how it felt, and made his way to the fire pit. His body was stiff from sleep but functional, his muscles remembering the work of the previous day. First task of any wilderness morning, revive the fire. He cleared away the ash covering the coals, exposing embers that still held heat. Kindling went on carefully, the driest twigs from his stockpile, arranged to catch the rising heat. Then he bent close and blew gently, steadily, feeding oxygen to the embers. The kindling caught. Smoke appeared, then small flames. He added slightly larger sticks, building the fire gradually, never rushing, letting each stage establish before adding the next level. Within 5 minutes, he had a legitimate fire burning again, flames crackling cheerfully, smoke rising straight up in the still morning air. Coffee was next. It was always coffee. He filled his metal pot with water from the bottle he'd filled last night, cold and clear from the stream, and positioned it on rocks at the fire's edge. While the water heated, he gathered more firewood from the forest, working in the gray pre-dawn light, selecting pieces by feel and weight as much as sight. The forest was waking around him. Bird songs increased in frequency and complexity. Squirrels chattered in the canopy. Somewhere in the distance, he heard what might have been an elk bugling, though the sound was faint enough that he couldn't be certain. By 7 a.m., with the water at a rolling boil, he made his coffee. Instant, because he wasn't precious about it, but hot and caffeinated and perfect for the moment. He sat at the entrance of his tree shelter, mug in hand, and watched the forest brighten as the sun rose somewhere beyond the canopy. This was the moment that justified everything. The planning, the hiking in, the work of setting up shelter. This quiet morning coffee in a place where he was the only human for kilometers in any direction, where his shelter was a hollow tree, and his kitchen was a fire pit, and his view was uninterrupted forest extending to the horizon. Breakfast was simple but satisfying. Oatmeal cooked with dried fruit, sweetened with a bit of brown sugar he'd brought, eaten directly from the pot to save on cleanup. Not elegant, but calories. His body needed fuel after yesterday's exertion, and for the work he had planned today. Because while the tree shelter was functional, it could be better. And he had a full day to make improvements. At 8:15 a.m., with breakfast finished and the fire burning steadily, the woodsman began his day 2 projects. First improvement, the entrance. The bark slabs he'd positioned yesterday worked adequately as a windbreak, but they could be better organized. He spent an hour creating a proper door system. 2 large bark pieces that could be overlapped and positioned to close off most of the entrance while still allowing ventilation through a gap at the top. The system was held in place by rocks at the bottom and propped with sticks at the sides. It wasn't perfectly sealed, didn't need to be, but it created a controllable barrier that would keep out wind and rain while allowing smoke to escape and fresh air to enter. Testing the door system, he found he could close it almost completely from inside, creating a surprisingly dark and enclosed space, or open it fully for maximum light and airflow. The flexibility was perfect. Second improvement, organization. Yesterday he'd simply dumped gear wherever it was convenient. Now, with time to spare, he created designated areas within the tree's interior. Sleeping area at the back, cooking gear near the entrance, spare clothing and equipment on the natural shelf he'd discovered, firewood stockpile just outside but protected by the trunk's overhang. He even created a small drying rack using sticks wedged into gaps in the charred walls, a place to hang damp clothing or gear where rising heat from the fire would dry them gradually. The transformation was significant. The tree had gone from a hollow log with some bedding in it to something approaching a legitimate dwelling, organized, functional, almost cozy. Third improvement, exploring the upper trunk. The hollow extended back 8 meters, but he'd only really used the first 3 meters as living space. He decided to investigate what the deeper interior offered. Crawling back into the darkness with his headlamp, he discovered that the hollow continued with remarkable consistency. Same diameter, same charred walls, gradually accumulating debris as he moved away from the entrance. About 6 meters in, he found something interesting, a section where the trunk had partially rotted through the side, creating a window-like opening about 30 centimeters across. The opening faced south, and when he positioned himself there, sunlight streamed through, illuminating the interior in a way that the entrance alone couldn't provide. It was perfect for reading, for working on gear, for simply having natural light deeper in the shelter. He cleared the area around this natural window, creating what amounted to a second room, a quiet space with filtered light, separated from the main living area, perfect for afternoon rest or contemplation. By 10:30 a.m., his improvements were complete, and the tree shelter had evolved into something genuinely impressive. Not just functional but comfortable, with distinct areas for different activities, natural lighting, ventilation control, and storage solutions. He stood outside, looking at his work, and allowed himself professional pride. This was bushcraft at its finest. Not fighting against nature but working with it, recognizing what the environment offered and enhancing it with skill and knowledge. The rest of the morning was spent exploring the immediate area more thoroughly. Yesterday he'd focused on gathering materials. Today he could appreciate the forest itself. He followed the stream upward, discovering a small waterfall about half a kilometer from his tree. A cascade maybe 3 meters high, creating a pool of crystalline water perfect for bathing if he could tolerate the cold. He filed that away as an option for later. Near the waterfall, he found more chanterelles and what looked like edible wood ear mushrooms growing on an alder log. He gathered both, knowing that tonight's dinner would benefit from fresh ingredients. He also found animal sign everywhere, elk tracks in the soft soil near the stream, bear scat that looked maybe a week old, countless small mammal trails through the understory. The forest was thriving with life, most of it nocturnal or avoiding the large bipedal intruder, but present nonetheless. By noon, he'd returned to his tree shelter and decided on a project that was pure luxury, a bench. Using a log he found nearby and some careful positioning, he created a sitting area right at the fire pit, a place to tend the fire without having to squat or kneel, a perch that would be perfect for evening contemplation. The bench was rough but functional, positioned at exactly the right height, stable and comfortable. He tested it, adjusted the position slightly, and declared it perfect. Lunch was simple: bread and cheese he'd brought, some of the mushrooms from this morning sautéed over the fire, water from the stream. He ate slowly, savoring each bite, listening to the forest sounds, watching light play through the canopy. At 2 p.m., clouds began moving in from the west. Not storm clouds, just the typical coastal weather system that brought afternoon drizzle to these mountains. He watched them approach with interest rather than concern. His shelter was about to be tested. By 2:30, the rain arrived. Light at first, then steadier, creating a constant patter on the canopy above. The woodsman retreated into his tree shelter and closed the bark door most of the way, leaving just enough gap for air circulation. Inside the tree, the rain was barely audible, just a distant whisper filtered through layers of wood and forest. The interior remained completely dry. Water ran off the trunk's exterior, following the grain and the angle, never penetrating the thick walls or finding the entrance. It was remarkably cozy. The fire continued burning at the entrance, protected from the rain by the overhanging trunk. Smoke vented properly despite the moisture. The temperature inside the tree remained comfortable. The woodsman sat on his fern bedding, back against the charred wall, and simply listened to the rain. He'd brought a book, a worn paperback he'd been meaning to finish, and now, by the natural light coming through the entrance and the window opening, he read while the forest outside received its afternoon watering. This was the other side of wilderness living that people rarely talked about. Not the dramatic survival moments or the physical challenges, but these quiet hours of simply existing in a space you'd created, being comfortable and dry while weather happened outside, reading a book by firelight in a hollow tree. By 4 p.m., the rain had passed, leaving the forest dripping and fresh-smelling. The woodsman emerged to gather more firewood. The day's burning had depleted his stockpile, and to prepare for the evening. He found more deadfall, selecting pieces that would dry quickly by the fire, building his stockpile back to comfortable levels. While gathering wood, he discovered a roosting grouse, perfectly camouflaged against a mossy log. He watched it for several minutes, admiring how completely it blended with its environment, before moving on and leaving it undisturbed. Dinner that evening was more elaborate than the previous night. rice cooked with the wood ear mushrooms, the remaining chanterelles sautéed with wild onions he'd found near the stream, and a bit of the jerked meat rehydrated in the cooking water. The mushrooms added an earthy richness, the wild onions a sharp bite that elevated everything. He ate slowly, making the meal last, watching the forest transition from day to evening. The varied thrush called again, its evening song slightly different from the morning's, more melancholy somehow. At 7 p.m., with the fire burning down to coals and darkness settling over the forest, the woodsman reflected on what this experience had taught him. The fallen tree had been an incredible find, better shelter than anything he could have built with a week of work. But the real lesson was in the enhancement, the transformation of raw material into refined living space. Anyone could crawl into a hollow log to escape the rain. The skill was in seeing the potential, in making systematic improvements, in creating comfort and functionality from what nature provided. It was the same principle that had guided human survival for millennia. Don't fight the environment. Partner with it. Recognize what it offers. Add skill and knowledge to enhance natural advantages. The tree had offered protection from rain and wind. He'd added insulation, organization, fire management, and door control. Together, nature's gift and human skill, they'd created something greater than either could produce alone. By 8:30 p.m., he was back in his sleeping bag, comfortable and warm, listening to the night sounds of the forest settling around him. Tomorrow he'd pack up, hike out, return to the world of electricity and running water and all the conveniences that made this kind of experience seem quaint or unnecessary. But tonight, in this hollow tree with a fire glowing at the entrance and the forest breathing around him, he was exactly where he needed to be. The woodsman had come into the wilderness seeking solitude and self-reliance. He'd found both, along with a fallen giant that had become home, and the quiet satisfaction that came from creating shelter with his own hands and the materials the forest provided. Tomorrow would bring the journey back. But tonight belonged to the tree, the fire, and the understanding that comfort didn't require walls and roof shingles, just skill, knowledge, and respect for what nature offered to those who knew how to see it. He closed his eyes and let sleep come, warm and dry in his hollow tree, while the forest kept watch and the fire burned down to embers that would be waiting when morning came again. Building shelter in the wilderness isn't about dominating nature, it's about recognizing what the forest offers and having the knowledge to transform those gifts into functional, comfortable living space. A hollow tree becomes home. Forest debris becomes bedding. Fallen bark becomes a door. Skills turn raw material into shelter that rivals anything built with modern tools. If this kind of authentic bushcraft and wilderness living speaks to you, real techniques, honest accounts of what works, and the satisfaction that comes from creating comfort with your own hands, subscribe to the Old World Survival right now. We document traditional skills that have kept people alive and comfortable for generations. No gimmicks. No fake survival scenarios. Just real knowledge applied in real wilderness, showing you exactly how our ancestors turned forests into homes and why those skills still matter today. Hit that subscribe button and join our community of bushcrafters, outdoorsmen, and traditional skills enthusiasts who understand that the best shelter is the one you build yourself from what nature provides.